Rabbi Angela Warnock Buchdahl serves as the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York City and is the first woman to lead the Reform congregation in its 180-year history. Born in Korea to a Jewish American father and a Korean Buddhist mother, Rabbi Buchdahl is the first Asian American to be ordained as a cantor or rabbi in North America. She has been nationally recognized for her innovations in leading worship, which draw large crowds in the congregation's historic main sanctuary and via live stream to viewers in more than 100 countries. Rabbi Buchdahl was invited by President Barack Obama in 2014 and President Joe Biden in 2023 to share blessings and light the menorah for the White House Hanukkah party. Rabbi Buchdahl serves on the boards of American Jewish Committee, the Asia Society, Yale University President's Council, and the New York Board of Rabbis. She has been featured in dozens of news outlets, including The Today Show, NPR, PBS, and Newsweek's America's 50 Most Influential Rabbis. Rabbi Buchdahl's memoir is Heart of a Stranger, an unlikely rabbi's story of faith, identity, and belonging. Joining Rabbi Buchdahl today is Moment Opinion and Books editor Amy E. Schwartz. Please welcome Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and Amy E. Schwartz.
Rabbi Buchdahl, thank you so much for coming on, and thanks for writing this amazing book. It was
Thank
tough to
you.
get on your calendar, and now I understand why. Among other things, aside from the personal story and things we'll talk about in a minute, I've rarely read a book that tied everything together so beautifully at the end. It was shaped almost like a novel. Um,
Well,
so
that
I'm
that last chapter actually was written after I'd written the entire book, and I had a different last chapter. And I had a good friend, now it's almost 2 years ago, a good friend who read the draft and said, um, I don't think this is the right ending. It actually ended with my son in Korea, which was also something that happened. And she says, you can't end your memoir with your son. And it was sort of like me looking kind of to the future. And the fact is, actually, when I wrote that last chapter, I had not yet made that trip to Korea with my mother and daughter. Isn't that
uh,
interesting? So, like, it's like life happened to me in the 5 years it took me before I wrote the book and finished it. So, um, anyway, that obviously became the right chapter. And I actually wrote it without a Devar Torah. I couldn't come up with one. And so I actually told my editor, I said, I think the last chapter could just stand on its own. It's the right ending. And then that idea of Pardes came to me, and it kind of hooked back up with paradise in the first chapter of Mount Rainier. And I was like, oh my gosh, it kind of almost felt cosmic. It had to marinate before we got to it. That's what I'd say.
right. Well, that's how it comes across reading. I won't spoil it for those who haven't finished the book yet, but that it really the last two lines gave me chills.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
so that was really lovely. So actually, let me start by asking you about it's sort of about that. It's not a contradiction exactly, but a paradox that seems to me is at the heart of your story. And on the one hand, your life and your background and your career trajectory are so singular. You're, as you call yourself, an unlikely rabbi. But then you end up showing that this experience of unlikeliness and being a one-off is, in fact, the thing everyone has in common and maybe the secret of your success, right? So before we get into the details, what I really want to know is, did the arc of your life always seem like that to you? Did it only emerge clearly as you were writing the book? Or I guess the other way of asking it would be, looking back so far, does your amazing career feel inevitable?
Ah, uh, no, I don't think that the gift of writing a memoir is that you have to be self-reflective and look big picture and create and make meaning of chapters that when you're living through them, you cannot have that kind of perspective. And the gift of doing this is that, I could retell some of the most painful chapters in my life and understand how they were essential to my becoming who I am. When you're in them, you just want to be out of them. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. It was destabilizing for me. And you don't think to yourself, oh, I'm so glad I get to do this because this will shape me into the person I am. You just want to get through it. But the bottom line is all of those chapters were essential for my becoming who I was. And through most of my life, I did feel like my life was, you know, uh, I was I felt like I was unlike anybody else. And when I finally told a bit of my story of feeling like the complete outsider in the Jewish community, I was already the senior rabbi of Central for many, many years. When I tell this story, a sermon on race and sort of my own, the kind of racism I experienced within the Jewish community in a way. And I actually worried that it was too particular of a story. Like, no, there were so few Jews of color in my community. There aren't other Korean Jews, just a tiny handful of them in the congregation. And I thought, is this just a selfish sort of my telling? And of course, for Jews of, but it was a time when our country was doing a lot of reckoning around race, and I wanted to talk about some of those issues within our own house, so to speak. And interestingly, not only did I get a huge amount of, notes and feedback from Jews of color around the country and in my community, but I got notes from people who weren't white Ashkenazi Jews with two Jewish parents. They had their story of why they felt like they were an outsider. Maybe it was because of their class issues and not being able to afford belonging to a synagogue, or because they grew up in Birmingham and they had this Southern accent and people didn't think they were really Jewish, or you can, or they had a convert, or they were a convert, or they had a convert parent, and or they have a disability, or they don't have any children, and they feel like the synagogue is only centered around families. I could just tell you story after story. And this is a truth that we know, but it sometimes takes learning it yourself, which is that in some ways, when you get to the most particular, real, raw experience of being human, that's when it's the most universal. And so
Mm.
I think I got a window into that from that sermon, which made me think, okay, I could tell my story, which I feel like in some ways, who can relate to this story? And on the other hand, I realized, wow, when you offer something that is deeply human and true, it just connects. And I talk a little bit about the fact that I read a lot of books, and I grew up just revering books. And in some ways, I never saw my exact story reflected in a book, being a biracial Jewish kid living in a Christian
And
world, and,
rabbi,
all of
right?
that. That wasn't obviously a story that I read. But there was a way that the stories of the Torah, which are such deep human, um, eternal kinds of stories, which capture something about human existence and human suffering and human dynamics and jealousies and personal relationships, that even though this is a thousands-year old text, is still relevant. Like, humans haven't changed that much. There's something about that is so profound. That was part of my goal, is to share that while my story wasn't in some books, it was in the Torah reflected, even though my story is so unusual. And that was part of the goal, was to express the way that the eternal stories of this wisdom tradition of Judaism has so much meaning and wisdom for today, for people of all faiths, for Jews, but also for those who are not, because these are the most, particularistic universal stories there are.
Hmm. Yeah, well, this is one of those ways in which you just pull things together in a way that seems surprising, and yet, once you see it, it's really there. Toward the end of the book, you talk about, well, if Jews are chosen for something, what are we chosen for? Are we chosen to be strangers?
Right. I mean,
Right?
here's an interesting tidbit. When I had a Giur ceremony, even though I was raised as a Jew my whole life, I did ultimately decide at age 21, which I write about in the book, that I would go through a Giur, which we translate as a conversion ceremony, right? And part of what helped me embrace that, because I rejected that idea for many years when it was first suggested to me at age 16, part of what helped me embrace it is that a rabbi, Elliot Dorff, said to me, you know, when you think of conversion in sort of the Western Christian notion, you're thinking of turning into something completely different, like you're converting, right? And he said the Jewish notion of Giur is affirming the Jewish soul that's always been in you. And that helped me embrace it. But here's the weird thing about the language of Giur. So the word lihit gayer, to, what we say to convert, comes from the same word as ger, which maybe
Hmm.
is the word for stranger. Why is it
Hmm.
that to become a Jew is literally to become the ger? Why wouldn't it be that what you would do is, when you become a Jew, is you would become lehit yached, which is to become a Yehudi? That verb exists in Hebrew. In fact, it shows up in the book of Esther. Near the end of the book of Esther, they actually forcibly convert people, and they use that word lehit yached, which is to turn people into Yehudim. it would make sense that if you're turning a ger, a stranger, into a Jew, you would use that verb to become a Yehudi. But it is lehit gayer, to become a stranger. This just, this is my chidush. I don't know if there's any backing on this, but my understanding of this is because if you want to be a Jew, you are deciding, you are taking on the heart of the stranger. You are deciding that that is going to be the essence of what it is to be the Jew. So you are converting to being the ger. And I think that that just affirms the sense that that's actually in some ways the what we are chosen for.
Hmm. Have you found since the book came out that other people who
Mm,
converted
no,
resonate?
maybe by putting this out on this webcast, someone will write me. I will have to
You haven't
take a
heard
little
about it
time
yet.
and look.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back before we get into a lot of your book is, in fact, about the formative experience of being both Korean and Jewish. And as you say, not really feeling at home in either culture, even though you were part of both cultures. Can you just talk a little bit about what that was like? I mean, how does it give you this soul of a stranger? How did you come to be both things?
I want to emphasize that even though there were times that I was made to feel like a stranger, I also felt very at home in both of these kinds of communities, usually because I found the people that made it feel like home. So in Korea, there's no question that being a biracial Korean in a 99% ethnic national state is really hard. And actually, it's even harder to be a biracial Korean than to be a white person in Korea, I think, because there was a status of biracial children that sort of originated from a kind of dark chapter of Korean life of like kind of state sanctioned prostitution at American army bases. So they would take basically uneducated, poor rural women and bring them to essentially uh, service Americans army base men. And when children were born of these unions, it was seen as such a shame on the country that even in the 1950s, they were shipping out biracial children for transnational adoption. They wanted them not to see these biracial children in Korea because it reminded them of something that they were ashamed of. And so there was a way that being a biracial child was highly stigmatized. And I didn't appreciate this as a 3 or 4 year old running around with my family in Korea who loved me. But my parents were very aware of it. And I think it is part of the reason that my parents felt like we could never, my sister and I could never really have the life that we would want for us in that country. We would be kind of forever second class citizens.
So
Um,
you returned here.
and so we moved to America, which and to Tacoma, which is not exactly a giant Jewish outpost, but it was already my father's family's home for 3 generations. So in some ways, I came into this community where my family didn't look anything like any other Jewish family at the synagogue, with 300 families. But I was also a Warnick, which meant I had lots of first cousins and my grandmother, and I could see my great grandfather's AZA basketball picture on the wall, and I felt like, oh, I have roots here. I belong here. And so there was something very powerful about this feeling of homeness, even as I recognized, well, nobody else looks quite like us in this synagogue. And my rabbi was embracing of my mother and our family. It was only when I ventured outside of this kind of warm bath of the Tacoma Jewish community that, BBYO events, Jewish camp for the first time, that I would get all the questions. And oh, wait a minute, how are you Jewish? What are you doing here? I was literally the only Asian face at my Jewish camp. At the time this was in the 80s at that point. It was still highly unusual. I was just on the cusp of the beginning of interfaith families being welcomed into Jewish spaces. And so that doesn't mean that there were absolutely no Jews of color, so to speak, but it's highly, highly rare. And so yes, I got questioned everywhere I went. Now, ultimately, I became youth group president. Ultimately, I became head song leader at Camp Swig. It's not that I didn't find my place ultimately and find my people. I would say that I remember distinctly this story of um, coming to America. I had a few months before I started kindergarten. I didn't speak a word of English when I arrived. I only was raised on Korean, my mother tongue. So my parents started only speaking English in the house because they were worried I was not going to be able to communicate when I got to school. And I got to school with, learning sort of still English. And my mom, packed me these seaweed lunches. So it was very obvious I was not from there. And the kids would say, "Where are you from?" And I very confidently said, "I'm from Korea," because felt like I was. But then my first visit back to Korea when I was 7 or 8 years old, it was in the summer vacation. I was playing with a bunch of Korean kids, speaking to them in Korean, and they said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Korea." And they said, "No, you're not." And I remember very distinctly, as one of my early memories of just going to my mother crying and saying, "I don't have a home. I don't belong anywhere." And
Mm,
my mother said, home is where your people are. You can make a home anywhere. And
wow.
that was such a wisdom. And I think my mom said that in a way also to remind herself of that, because I think she also felt like she was no longer kind of your typical Korean woman. She had married this American man. There was a certain way that she did not relate to her college friends when she would come back and visit. Their lives had taken such a different trajectory, but she also never felt fully American, I think. Um, and there's a way that you can deal with that. You can find your people and make home and make belonging, which is what every human being desires and needs in life. But you also constantly get reminders that you're a stranger as well. And so I think my mom appreciated that and understood that, but also always put this positive spin on it, and always said, like, you find your people, you'll make your home.
Your mother sounds remarkable. I mean, but it sounds like both
She
your parents were
is.
sort of amazing,
Both of them are amazing in
Um,
in different ways. I mean, my father was just a rock and like just kind of like unconditionally loving, supportive, present. My mother was a real fighter. And I mean, I think she came by that honestly. She herself was also an immigrant to Korea, which is kind of strange. She was born in Japan during the Japanese occupation of Korea. So she actually moved back to her homeland at the age of 5, but her mother had a Japanese accent to her Korean because she had been raised most of her life in Japan as a Korean woman, but
right.
as a second class citizen in Japan. So my mother already came to her own homeland in some ways as a stranger family. So this boundary crossing, it's a story that has been repeated through the generations in my family, both on the Jewish side and ironically on the Korean side too.
Wow.
But I think that
So
gave her a kind of grit and strength.
sounds like it. So would you say, which of your parents would you say was more surprised that you found this early calling to be a rabbi, that it was so clear and straight? It sounds like it was clear in you from really quite an early age. That must have astonished them both.
Yeah, I think that I came back from my first trip to Israel at age 16, and I announced to my parents that I wanted to be a rabbi. And I would say that I think my father from the beginning was sort of like, great, honey, you can do anything you want to do, that kind of thing. I think my mother also raised me to feel like I could do anything I set my mind to. She really like, that was a mantra. And yet it wasn't, she was, I wouldn't say exactly discouraging, but she was not encouraging of it. And I think it's not because she thought I couldn't do it, learn what I needed to learn, all of that. I think she thought that the Jewish world was not ready for me and was not going to accept me. And she said, you've got three strikes against you. You're a woman, you have a non-Jewish mother, and you're Korean. And she said, like, what, like, who's going to hire you? And she knew I had already been rejected by Jews in different settings who sort of didn't accept me as fully Jewish. And we'd had some of these conversations already. And so I think she sort of felt like, why do you want to put yourself up for that? Like, why do you want to make it so hard for yourself? You can do anything. Why would you do that? I would say that, and she sort of, when I said I wanted to go east for college because of this, because I had this like romantic idea that most of it came from Jewish books like All of a Kind Family, that New York was the center of the Jewish universe and I needed to be near New York. I then, it shifted my whole trajectory of like going east for college um and wanting to be a religious studies major. And my mother was like, just go with an open mind. You don't have to settle on that yet, honey. So, and I promised I was going to come back to the West Coast. I didn't. And I, I think it's interesting because on the one hand, the subtitle of this book is The Unlikely Story of a
Hmm.
Rabbi, a rabbi's unlikely story. Someone read this book and said to me, Angela, you say it's an unlikely story, but I read all the things about who you were as a kid, and it felt like the most likely story I've ever heard. He said like you were like talking to God on the swing set and leading your sister in prayers when you were 8 and song leading and doing all these things and going to Israel. And in some ways, it felt like he said it felt almost preordained. And I was like, well, yes, on the one hand, yeah, I guess that was it to me. I felt almost like I can't imagine doing anything else. And I think it's only because I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life that I stuck with it, even when it was really hard, because it's just all I could think of that I wanted to do. It was, I guess maybe that's what you would call a calling, although I don't use that language very often. But I do think that there was something that felt like it was what I had to do with my life. And so it didn't matter if I wasn't going to get hired. I just didn't want to do anything else.
So there's this moment, you say it was inevitable, that you became a rabbi. You couldn't, I said, that sounds like a calling. And there's this really quite remarkable moment in the book, especially given what you just said about your mom, that you're in Israel and you're miserable because, you're failing at everything. You feel like you're not accepted, and you call her and you're saying, "This is it. I don't need to be Jewish. No one, I'm going to stop being Jewish. I don't look Jewish. I don't sound Jewish. No one will ever miss me." Um, and she says, "Is that really possible?" And you realize you can't stop being Jewish. So, I mean, is that just your mother reconciling to it, or just because she knew you better than anybody else?
Yeah, so that was already 4 or 5 years after I want to be a rabbi. I think my mom understood at that point that this was something that, at that point I had already moved east. I had already been the religious studies major. I had already been leading high holiday services at college. Like she saw that, and this was already now my third trip to Israel. So like I had already returned to Israel post Bronfman. And I think my mom understood this is who I really wanted to, not only who I was, but what I wanted to do with my life. And so and also how much it was informing the way that I saw the world and everything else. So yeah, her question was so wise. And so often, as we know as Jews, like a question is more important than an answer or an affirmation. And her asking that forced me to actually say, okay, wait, could I actually stop being a Jew? Like, could I? And it wasn't until I was really confronted with that I recognized that it was as bone deep in me as anything else that I cannot shed, my Koreanness, being a woman, being who I am. And I actually found that deeply comforting, and helpful. And it was the beginning of my coming to feel like I could embrace the idea of Gior, for example, this, as we talked about, this kind of reaffirmation ceremony. But I also think it sort of quieted something deep in me that had been stirring and agitated for many years, like pretty much almost all through my college time. And it enabled me to actually go and apply to rabbinical school with a different state, and then to mark it with a ritual at the mikveh in Seattle with my hometown rabbi and two other rabbis, with my family. I felt like it was not just affirming my Jewishness, it was affirming my mother's influence on me, because it was acknowledging in some ways that I wasn't the same as someone who had two Jewish parents. I had this strong influence of my mother as well, and I was choosing Judaism with that, which was not a rejection of her. It was in some ways almost more of an acknowledgement of her impact. So um, it ended up being a very powerful and important ritual.
So one of the related emotional peaks in the book actually is when you attend the Reform Biennial in San Diego, and you actually take the opportunity you're addressing the group and you honor her, and you take the opportunity to honor your mother, and there's all this applause, and this is when you realize that being the stranger is what links you to everybody there. Um,
Yeah, I mean, that was a peak moment of my life, and she would say it was one of the great moments of her life too. But she raised me and my sister as Jews with a great deal of sacrifice. She felt, first of all, she didn't really necessarily raise us, obviously, to be her religious tradition. But more than that, I think there was a way that she always felt like she was um, a guest in our community, in our religious community. And that's a hard thing, to kind of always feel a little bit outside what the rest of your family is a part of in a deep way. And that was like she came down when I was leading that biennial, which was in San Diego. She flew down, and she'd always had sort of gatekeepers, even leading up to the biennial itself, where she came straight from the airport with her little rolly suitcase and goes up to the front of the convention center. And the man says, took one look at my little short Korean mother and said, "I think you're at the wrong convention, ma'am." She was like, and she said, "Is this the Jewish convention? My daughter is leading services here." And they were like, "Okay, okay." And so she, even there, it was like the
Yeah.
entry into this community was like, "I don't think you belong here, ma'am." And
Mm.
and then for her to, immediately go to the bathroom and overhear people while she's in the bathroom stall talking about me, because it had literally just been announced that week that I was going to be the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue, and it had not been approved even by the congregation, but it was announced essentially. And so there was like a bit of a buzz around it because it was an unusual thing for Central. It was a big deal. I was a woman. I was the cantor before. I was the first Asian American. So there was sort of some buzzing around this. And my mom, comes out of the bathroom stall and said, "That's my daughter. You're talking about my daughter." And she was very proud. So then to go into this service with 6,000 Jews in this giant convention hall, and as I acknowledged my mother, and in many ways the sacrifice she made, but not just her, I actually acknowledge that there are non-Jewish partners in so many Jewish families right now who raise their children in this faith, and how grateful I am for what they have done to create Jewish families and the next generation of Jewish children, often at a sacrifice of their, for their own comfort sometimes and familiarity. And so then I acknowledge my mother and all the other non-Jewish partners who have done this. And her face shows up on the giant jumbotron behind me, and the whole crowd erupts in a giant ovation for my mother, and she's crying and I'm crying. And it was really one of those moments where she felt like it wasn't just that she was welcomed as a guest. I think it was the first time she felt truly honored by the Jewish community for what she had done. And it was very powerful to have that moment.
That's an amazing story about all sorts of things, but also about mothering. That's
Yes.
imagine having your mothering honored like that, you know. But because because that's the springboard to your insight in the book, at least about the stranger being the universal feeling of not belonging. Um, let me ask you, how do you turn that outward? I mean, I know that's in a large part the work that you do, but how can that feeling be used, that shared feeling, to allow us to live together in today's America?
I told you that I was surprised when I shared that very particular personal story of the ways I felt like an outsider and how much I got a response back from the Jewish community. But what I would open the aperture a little bit more and say, because I also belong to the Korean and Asian community, there has been so much conversation in the Asian community around, especially post-pandemic, of how the Asian community has felt that we have not been able to fully integrate as Americans. We're these hyphenated Americans that we've been, ostracized and prejudiced against. And and then, of course, we know, the racial reckoning that is still happening in America, and the kind of uh, counterbalancing, like, attack now on DEI. And it's just like there is still a war going on around race in this country. I don't think that there's really, it's very difficult to be an immigrant right now in America, and the language around immigrants. So there is not, I think, a minority group in America that doesn't feel in some ways like the stranger in America right now. But I guess the irony here is that even white Christian men, I'm hearing language from them like, we're misunderstood, we're being marginalized, we do not feel completely at home here. And I thought to myself, okay, wow, if that is also the case, which I think it absolutely is right now, then we are touching the most human experience. There is not a group in America that in some context doesn't feel that they are on the outside. And so now some people choose to use that feeling of outsiderness to say what we need to do is build higher walls to close the doors. And I guess what I would say is there are lots of responses to having the heart of a stranger. Our Jewish tradition, our biblical text, tells us and gives us a blueprint for how this feeling is not only core, but it is the it is the reason for our empathy. It is the reason for our fighting for the most vulnerable. It is our reason for actually having to be more creative in finding a different pathway if you can't go the first way, that people block your way. It has been the source of our resilience and our grit as a Jewish people, because this is not just the story of Abraham and Sarah. It's not just the story of 400 years of enslavement in Egypt. It's also 2,000 years of diaspora existence. It's also the way that Jews are feeling in America right this moment. Um, Especially after I think decades of feeling pretty comfortable and at home. And so I think, again, we have a wisdom tradition that helps us make sense of these moments and of this feeling and to turn it into a positive superpower of ours, as opposed to something that embitters us and pushes us away from others. So I would love for the invitation here is that we use that feeling of strangeness, of marginalization, that is such a human experience, and actually use it as our starting point for human connection. You reach across the aisle to someone that you think, I can't imagine you feel like a stranger the way I do, but ask them the story of why they are. And you will find that there is something much deeper that connects all of you, that we're all looking for belonging and home. And we can help each other with that as opposed to just pushing each other out of these places. And you froze again. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, there
Do you
you are.
see that message? Okay, let's just fingers crossed.
Start that one more
Do you
time.
see that message um, resonating? Okay. Do you see that message resonating with your congregation? I mean, can you feel it working? I mean, are there stories from the pulpit about that message, changing people or changing their feelings
Absolutely.
about
I
things?
mean, as I said, I think it's part of the reason not only that I got such a response from my own community, and I don't mean just Jews of color, as I said beyond, but it was actually the first sermon I've given that what I would call went viral.
Mhm.
And so it was people were sharing it. I remember walking into a Nordstrom's and someone, literally a salesperson said that their head of like sensitivity training asked everyone to watch the sermon. And I thought to myself, that's crazy. And I think that there is, I did have a line in there about imagining what happened to my black congregant who he said when I walked in and the security guard trailed him in. And then each week, even though he almost didn't come back after that, each week people would say, now, why are you here? Where did you come from? And, we don't think of that as being particularly racist, but imagine that someone walked into a Nordstrom's and the security guard trailed them in. And then they get to the jewelry counter and the woman says, now, why are you here? Now,
Mhm.
we recognize that
Right.
that doesn't
And
feel good at
synagogues,
all.
and your synagogue, yeah,
Yeah. So actually, I
right. And synagogue's
understood.
supposed to be your home. You don't want to have that experience.
Right. Right. And that question, while you might think that your intention is curiosity or even perhaps welcome, what it's communicating is you obviously don't belong here. So let me either welcome you or let me figure out why you're here. And those questions, when they're asked over and over again, repeatedly, every time someone walks into a Jewish space, it really is exhausting, and it also makes someone feel like, wow, I guess I will never be at home here. People will never see me as one of them. And but that feeling, I think that it resonates deeply. And it's not just that it was that sermon. I think that because I know what it feels like to be that stranger, because I knew what it was like to walk into Jewish spaces and feel like people are looking at me like I don't belong here, or all those ways that we tell ourselves we're not enough. I'm not literate enough. I don't know enough Hebrew. I'm not observant enough. I don't do enough ritual. I hear all these deficiencies from Jews apologetically all the time. When someone finds out I'm a rabbi, they have to tell me all their Jewish guilt for all the things that they're not enough about. Um, and I think that the big thing that is attracting people to come to services, to watch on live stream, is because I think we don't presume belonging. And I think we work hard to make sure that you feel like this is your home. And we communicate that in a lot of different ways, from like who we honor to what we translate to how we teach as we go along, with this presumption that like you might think you're not enough, you're enough. And we'll take you whichever, like whatever state you're in right now. And it's a very low judgment space. And I think that all of that is communicated in ways that I can articulate, but also many ways that I probably don't even know how to articulate because it's just a feeling of knowing what it's like to be there. And I think that that's so the best way I can tell that it's quote working in some way is just by the number of people who walk in and say, I walked in and I feel like I just belong here. These are my people. People say something like that. And I don't even know what that means. It's a very diverse community, but it's that feeling.
And that's the feeling you yourself always had. So
Hmm.
somehow these are your people. But
Yeah.
so maybe this is related in a way, and but a slightly different direction. Throughout the book, you talk about you affirm the redemptive quality of, well, let's say, productive disagreement. And in fact, you have an interpretation I've never seen before, a really fascinating positive spin on the line about two Jews, three opinions, which I've never heard anyone
Well,
suggest.
I think I made it up. I made it
Did
up
you
when I
make it
wrote
up?
this sermon.
Do you want to tell it? Because then I have a question. But
Sure.
you know,
Yeah, I mean, I was writing a high holiday sermon about productive disagreement, or also the Jewish propensity for disagreement and debate, which is built into, is a thousands year old tradition, right? At the time that the Christian world was writing the Nicene Creed to create a uniformity of belief across Christendom, and which is an understandable and worthy task because you want Christians who are all over the world to think this, to believe the same thing and practice the same ways. But at the same time that that was being codified in the fourth century, we were codifying the Talmud, which is, I call it a compendium of good rabbinic arguments, which does decidedly does not tell you this is how you have to practice or this is what you must believe. It actually creates a lot of openness for debate. And in fact, it records those debates. And so there's a very strong belief that being in conversation, not just conversation, but in particular in Hevruta, to be learning with someone who is pushing back and debating and disagreeing and in dialogue with you is the Jewish way of learning. So that is the traditional Hevruta style of learning, and you learn in noisy Beit Midrash, and you talk and argue. So the most famous Hevruta, perhaps of all time, is the one between Rabbi Yochanan, who is the head of the academy, and he's very, very learned and had been learning his whole life, and Reish Lakish, who was formerly a bandit and kind of had street smarts, but was not at all educated in a traditional book smart kind of way. And yet here was this odd couple studying together, and they were very good because they were each other's sparring partners and they weren't intimidated by each other. And at one point, Yochanan insults Reish Lakish, reminds him of his like horrible past, and Reish Lakish gets so upset that he actually ends up dying. And Rabbi Yochanan is now inconsolable. So they bring him a new Hevruta who is supposed to be the most genius, brilliant person they can find. And every time Rabbi Yochanan makes an argument, this genius new Hevruta says, oh, I know exactly where the proof text is for that thing. And he brings him the proof text. And at a certain point, quickly, Yochanan gets very exasperated. And he said, like, I don't need you to tell me I'm right. I know I'm right. When I used to bring an argument to Reish Lakish, he would bring 24 counter arguments. And when he did that, it would sharpen my thinking and we would come to some understanding that was different than the one we had before. So now when I was writing this sermon, I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, they got to some idea they couldn't get to on their own. And I thought about that joke that we all know, two Jews, three opinions. And I used to not quite understand the joke. It's funny, but it doesn't make sense because if you just want to say that Jews are argumentative, you could say two Jews, two opinions. Like, where is that third opinion coming from, right? It just means that you think differently. But the third opinion is what you can come to that transcends either of your original opinions, but you can only come to that third opinion when you are actually in argument and dialogue. It's the thing that Yochanan and Reish Lakish got to when they were sharpening their thinking and getting a little bit closer to truth, to understanding, to something. And I have to live this truth all the time. I wouldn't say it's comfortable or easy. And in fact, the fact that Yochanan ultimately ends up dying also because he's so frustrated with this new Hevruta and he's already killed off his first Hevruta, who was his true partner, it points to how difficult it is to be in those relationships. Like I'm in a community that is highly diverse. I'm so proud of that. I feel it is my sacred responsibility to keep everyone in this tent, and it takes work because there are times when we disagree and it's not comfortable to disagree. And when you feel like it's existentially important, when we are feeling particularly vulnerable or fearful, these things take on a heightened emotional impact. And it's very hard to disagree civilly. And it's very hard not to feel that your idea is not just you disagree, but that it's threatening to you. And so I imagine that's what happened with Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is why they ultimately had this fissure and break. But I do think that we have been given the tools and the model in Judaism to argue well and to see this as a virtue, and to say that this is how you come to intellectual honesty and to greater truth. Um, and so I value this pushback that I get from my community, and I don't get it just from one side. I'm getting it in lots of directions. I do think that it makes me a better rabbi. It doesn't allow me to kind of take things on face value. I have to actually really interrogate my ideas, and yes, my ideas do shift. I do come to third opinions regularly because someone has pushed me to think beyond kind of the group think that sometimes is easy and intellectually lazy and that we can fall into, or that our team is thinking about. And so we just accept what the team think is. And so I think that that is a very important part of my rabbinate. And I think that too many of those quote third spaces where people met with ideological differences and used to know each other as human beings, those places have disappeared in America. It used to be churches and synagogues. It used to be bowling clubs. It used to be Elks clubs and all these things that brought people together for other purposes, and it wasn't political. We've lost a lot of those spaces, so we have lost our places of meeting and knowing and conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, so you had an experience. It's a good segue because you had an experience not that long ago. You and the whole community, um, in the recent campaign, the Zoran Mamdani campaign in New York for and you there was it was very polarizing in a lot of ways, and you also kind of found yourself in the if not in the middle, then at least in one of the arguments. There was a letter that you didn't sign, and some people signed and some people didn't sign. Can you talk about that, all like that experience in this framework at all? I mean, how
Yeah,
did you get through
absolutely.
that with these principles?
I mean, holding holding multiple things doesn't mean that I don't have strong feelings or truths that I come to. And I think what was not up for debate, and I think my congregation understood, is that we are a Zionist congregation. I'm proudly a Zionist. I don't think that I think besides the fact that I've made 5 trips to Israel since October 7th, and we have prayed for hostages in the state of Israel literally every Shabbat since October 7th happened, and had a flag on our bima for until every last hostage came home. There Fighting anti-Semitism is something I've spoken about publicly from the Bema. Even 6 years ago, I gave a high holiday sermon before Pittsburgh, and people then said, "Why are you talking about anti-Semitism? It's not a big deal." And then it, of course, has been a big deal. And so, what was not up for debate is my stance against anti-Zionist rhetoric, fighting anti-Semitism, being a Zionist congregation. All those things were clear. And I think that what was questioned was whether or not I was willing to publicly denounce or endorse candidates in an election in which these issues came up to the fore. And I really
Uh-oh,
felt
another
that my
freeze.
congregation. I really felt that my congregation knew where I stood on the Jewish issues, and I think it's very dangerous for rabbis to get into the business of making, not speaking politics. I've spoken about politics before, and I do when I think it enters into um, the Jewish moral space. But endorsing a candidate is a line that I think is still against the law. First of all, in New York State, it's just that the IRS has said recently they wouldn't prosecute it, but it is there because it has helped protect the separation of church and state, which has been a fundamental value that has protected Jews and religious minorities in America. I think this separation of church and state has been part of what has made America exceptionally good for Jews and other religious minorities. And not only that, but you can see the dangers both to Judaism and democracy when that line becomes very fuzzy. You can imagine a time, and maybe we've already crossed that line, where there can be rabbis or ministers who trade, the votes of their congregation for political favors for their community. That is very bad for democracy, and that is very bad for religion and religious figures because it morally corrupts them, and it's corrupting of the position. You can also imagine where donations can come into a synagogue and people can say, I'm going to give you this donation if you'll endorse this candidate. Or imagine this, because I actually heard some of this, I'm going to withhold a donation if you do not endorse this candidate or denounce this candidate. These are not things that people should be doing with their religious leaders, and religious leaders should not be caving to pressure to do that. Because I really think that it is degrading of the position ultimately of religious authority, and it's also bad for democracy. So I would say that this is why I took a very hard line on not doing that particular kind of political speech. Um,
Not
and
signing a letter, to be clear,
now,
right?
now
Not signing a
signing the letter
letter.
is slightly different. But what I would say about signing letters is that there is a kind of deep pressure and mob think that can happen with these letters. You see a certain number of signatures and then you feel pressured, and then people will also pressure you to sign them. And in the past, I used to sign letters occasionally. Um, Especially, I'd say, 8 years ago, there were so many of these letters that were happening with the first Trump presidency. I found them, first of all, not to be pretty much completely ineffective. But second of all, I watched that as Central's profile was growing, and maybe mine as well. I saw the ways that my name was being pulled out of these letters. There could be 1,000 rabbis, but they would pull mine out and make me the headline. And I was being manipulated, and my name was being used, and my synagogue's name was being used in ways that were beyond my control. And I did not like that. And I want to speak for myself. And usually I agree with the intent of the letter, but I don't always agree with the exact wording of the letters, which I don't write myself. And I find that, like, then something that's not exactly the way I would have put it is the thing that gets pulled out, and then it's misrepresenting the way I actually feel. So many years ago, I said, I do not sign letters, period, even when I agree with them. And I pretty much agreed with this last letter, but I was not signing it. I also did not sign the letter that 1,000 rabbis signed in August around, quote, starvation in Gaza. Now, I also was, no one wants to see people suffering in Gaza. I did not want to see suffering in Gaza, but I did not agree with the way that some of this wording was. Plus, I don't sign letters, but people were saying, but 1,000 rabbis signed this. Doesn't that mean that you, like, are you right? And I was like, well, that's interesting you say that. What about the letter that was about starvation in Gaza? Would you have wanted me to sign that letter 4 months ago? And I don't think that people appreciate these letters come out all the time, and they are often signed by 1,000 rabbis across the spectrum, and for good reason. I'm not actually demeaning that the intent that people have when they sign them is for a good reason. They want to show a sort of strength in numbers, but I do think they get used. I think the fact that that rabbi's letter was actually literally pulled out at the mayoral debate and used as a weapon is exactly the reason that we shouldn't be signing letters like that, because we just got used as a political cudgel in a debate. And that's exactly what we should not be doing with our names. And I think that that is, I hope people can appreciate that you might disagree with whether I should have signed the letter, but it was a principled decision to not sign letters like that.
Just for those who maybe were not obsessing about the Zoran Mamdani campaign, this was a letter that basically said the Jewish community might be made unsafe by a Mamdani mayoralty, right? Isn't that or might
Yeah,
feel
I think
unsafe?
that's fair.
Yeah. So
And I
how
did share that. And ultimately, what I realized, because there was so much um, understandable fear and worry about this campaign and some of the Jewish questions that it raised, and the kind of normalization of anti-Zionism that this represented, because he is an avowedly anti-Zionist mayor, now of the largest Jewish city in America. That is something that concerns me as a rabbi. I will say that out loud. And ultimately, I realized that while I have spoken about all of these topics many times, that there were things that he had said that I would have condemned if he weren't in the middle of election. And I realized that people needed to hear me say it, because um, it was it was hard to have, I guess, any shred of doubt, I guess. And so I did not denounce or endorse voting for him. But I did say these particular things that have been said are very troubling. And some of them cross the line into anti-Semitism. And I shared that in a sermon which is kind of unusual because I came out of sabbatical to give that sermon because I really felt that my community needed to hear from me, and I needed to be present to the community in this moment. And so I came back and offered that sermon, and I think that made clear everything that might not have been clear enough before.
And how do you turn down the thermostat, not just on something like this, but on all these other disagreements that are just tearing the community apart?
I mean, I think that what we really need to continue to do is focus our attention on what the true threats are. And the fact that we turned on each other, that we turned, Zionist with Zionist fighting with each other, pitting as if it was rabbi against rabbi in these conversations. That is, there were, a colleague of mine who gave a sermon that denounced and endorsed candidates specifically. They were putting our pictures next to each other as if we are on opposite sides of a fight, when we actually think pretty much we have a very aligned views on this. We just chose different strategies for how to address the issue. But it is not, that is a crazy red herring that is pulling us from our true fights here. And we have real threats. We have real anti-Semitism that's coming at us from the left and the right that we need to actually address. We need to stop fighting each other, and try and stop making arguments that don't really exist between us. That is not helpful. We have to focus our attention on the real work that we have to do. And we have to stay together and united as a Jewish community in this.
So one more question about Israel, not specifically on the news. I was struck that when you write about your trips to Israel, your many trips to Israel, one of the things you talk about is how similar you realized Israel is to Korea. Um,
I shared that mostly when I went back to Korea for the first time as a rabbi, meaning like I've been to Korea many, many times. But when I go to Korea, I'm generally just like, I'm just a biracial Korean. Nobody knows I'm Jewish. No one knows I'm a rabbi when I'm there. And it's just not a part of, it's almost like I have to subsume that identity when I'm there. But the first time, just in summer of 2024, that I ever went to Korea as a Korean woman and as a rabbi was when I was asked to give the opening address for the Israel Education Research Center at Seoul National University, which is sort of the flagship public university of Korea, and it was the first um, higher education place to learn Hebrew, Israeli history, Jewish studies in the country, which is actually kind of astonishing to me that this was the first time that this was being offered at a university level. And I was deeply honored to be asked to give the keynote address at the opening of this Israel Center at Seoul National University. And when I was doing this, I did a little bit of research, and I was sort of shocked to see these two countries, which in some ways are so different from each other and have had, frankly, very little interaction with each other, Israel and Korea. I was shocked to see that there were some incredible similarities between them. Let's just start with the fact that these are ancient peoples, the Koreans and the Jews, but their modern state nations were both formed within 2 months of each other in 1948. Yeah. Uh, May of 1948 for the state of Israel, I believe August of 48 for Korea. And then they
Nobody
are,
knows. That's crazy.
yeah, they are both countries that have hostile neighbors from their inception. And so they have mandatory military service and have a kind of a defensive posture that they've had to take their entire existence as countries. These are both countries that have almost no natural resources. You don't have oil, you don't have almost anything. And so you've got a lot of desert in Israel, you got a lot of mountains in Korea. And so what they do is they actually invest in their greatest resource, which are people. And you have in these countries a higher per capita educational level in Korea and in Israel than almost any other nation of like advanced degrees, for example. They're among the highest in the world. They also spend per capita, they're kind of neck and neck in who is number one, but they alternate between Korea and Israel on spending per capita on research and development.
Huh.
This is why these are two of the IT capitals of the world, even though they're relatively new countries and they're relatively small. Israel, even smaller, of course, than Korea at around 55 million people. So you've got, and you also have two countries that have, in recent memory, um, been oppressed to the state where the people were supposed to be wiped out. The Japanese occupation was trying to erase Korea and Korean culture, refusing to let Koreans speak Korean, to be given Korean names. I mean, they really tried to erase Korean culture. And you obviously have Jews who've lived through the Holocaust. So you have these peoples that have actually really known in recent memory, in the 20th century, what oppression looks like, and the desire to wipe them out, which has created a kind of resilience and grit in these peoples that are astonishingly similar as well. So, yes, you have vast differences, and I can name those as well. But you also have some kind of astonishing similarities between these two countries. And I saw the ways that there is so much that Korea and Israel can learn from each other. And there are new funds, for example, the Korean government just started a new fund for the first time. It's relatively small, but it's the first of its kind where they're taking Israeli startup know-how with Korean scalability and innovation. And so the powering up of sort of these two powerhouses, I think, could do amazing things. And that's just in one realm. But I think in education as well, there's a certain way that Koreans and Jews value education at a very high level. And you see this in the advanced degrees and the research and development these countries have invested in. And I think that they could really work together. So for me, to be a Korean rabbi and to be able to mark this coming together of the two countries and the desire to learn from each other, it was in some ways a culminating experience of my life. My parents and my sister flew out for this moment because they were so excited as well. And it really did feel like maybe it was just for this moment that I could help be a bridge.
Interesting. And in a weird way, I think Jews kind of need to hear something like that because there's so much feeling in parts of the community or maybe the whole community that, oh, nobody, we're so different from everybody else and the experiences are so ununderstandable. So, maybe these unexpected parallels are sort of healthy to look at.
Yeah, it's
Um,
good to be reminded. And I think also, if nothing else, like, I mean, we need to do what we can to build bridges and allies. We cannot, I know we are a nation that stands alone. I don't think that that's actually the blessing we're looking for. And I think, it does sometimes feel almost like is this our destiny? But I actually deeply believe we have to continue to build bridges. And I mean, it was astonishing to me when most of the academic world globally was closing its doors on Israel, that Korea was, I think, maybe the only country that I knew of that post October 7th opened an Israel Center, and opened its doors to Israeli academics. So I think that that's something to be celebrated.
That's very interesting. So your book's full of, striking anecdotes about your rabbinical work, and none more so than how you coped with COVID. Um, so can you tell that story about the candle flame and the tallit? It so captures the flavor of those times.
Yes, I mean, so we were in, the very beginnings of COVID lockdown, trying to figure out what does it look like to lead a community all virtually. And I had a congregant who very generously had arranged for me to be in their house in Connecticut. It was supposed to be for my sabbatical. I was going to rent the house for my sabbatical, which was 4 months long. We ended up living there for 10 months during this pandemic when my college age son came back home and we were all Zooming everything. So my first Friday night service in this old Connecticut, basically farmhouse that's been converted. I am jerry rigging up my table for making this Shabbat tableau. I've got my computer up on a few art books, and I've got the candlesticks up on four more art books over here. I'm trying to make a nice picture in the screen that looks like a peaceful Shabbat experience. Meanwhile, the blue screen, the green screen behind me is like projecting a window so that it looks like I'm in some place that looks very nice. Meanwhile, I've got the cord going all the way out to like with an extension cord because this house is not rigged for live streaming. Anyway, as I near the end of the service, I lean over to light the Shabbat candles, then to pick up the Kiddush cup and the challah. And as I do, I feel very warm. Now, I've been sweating through this whole service because it's very hard to lead on Zoom. But I realize I've caught fire. Like my tallis has caught fire on the candlesticks as I've leaned over to get my challah. And it was just like emblematic of this whole thing. And it was sort of like Shabbat Shalom. And, it was a surreal experience leading. And I didn't realize how much when I'm leading services, which I actually find one of the most joyful things I get to do. I'm in the flow when I lead services, but I realize I'm so reliant on some energy that's coming back to me whenever I lead to keep putting it out into a space that was invisible to me, like to a community that I had to just trust was there and listening and not being able to receive anything back. It was exhausting to lead services that way without anyone present. And that, yeah, that was just a little window into what my Shabbat experience looked like in COVID.
I just love the image of that, and the congregation sees this whole thing happen, and you say,
Yes, exactly. And I'm like,
and you
ah,
ran to help, I'm on fire, you know. But yeah, no. So one thing everybody knows about you is that you sing.
ah.
I saw that. I saw that clip of you on doing harmony, doing somewhere over the rainbow with Stephen
With Stephen Colbert. That was really
part
fun.
harmony. I think a lot of people saw that. It's a wonderful scene. But you know, you talk in the book a little bit about studying for going to cantorial school kind of as a sideline because you wanted to be in New York to, you know, with your then fiance. Um, how do you think like being a cantor first affected your work as a rabbi? Is the music still central to what you do?
Oh, 100%. And it is funny that like I tell the story, which is true, that in some ways it was like a workaround in order to get to New York, to going to cantorial school. It wasn't part of the original plan. But I also deeply believe that there's a hand of God in almost anything. And I feel like it was meant to be and preordained because I can't imagine being a rabbi without also being a cantor. And I can't imagine thinking that I could move the energy of a room the way I can with music, which I still do to this day, if I had just been a kind of song leading, guitar playing rabbi and didn't really learn the breadth of Jewish musical memory that I learned in cantorial school. And so, once I did that first year, I thought maybe I was just going to do 1 year. Once I was hooked. I was like, I've got to keep learning this. I love Chazanut. I love all this Jewish musical um, body of work. I love modes. I needed to learn all of it. And I also needed to improve my voice because frankly, I had not taken a voice lesson until I got to cantorial school. And suddenly I realized like I have a long way to go here to be able to make my voice do what I can hear in my head and make my voice actually do that. And so I was fortunate that I got to invest in that kind of time and that kind of work. And I had a long way to go. I won most vocally improved 2 years in a row, just to give you a sense of like where I started. So if you hear my voice now, that is not what I sounded like when I started cantorial school. And it was challenging and hard, but I do feel deeply grateful. And I work with two extraordinary cantors right now and they are generous enough to give me space to sing with them, to lead at times, and it is still, I think, my primary spiritual language.
Do you think it's part of that work to open out Jewish liturgical music to other sources? I know you're known for singing "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" and saying that that's really a Jewish anthem in a way, and you also talk about doing a mashup with a Korean folk song when you did that opening in Korea. Is that, I mean, does Jewish music have to sort of open up to the outside world to
I,
you know?
I would argue that Jewish music always has. It's always been influenced by the musical language of where we live. So there's a reason that like Moroccan melodies or like Mizrahi piyutim or Sephardi piyutim sound very different than like Eastern European Hazanut, right? I mean, we have been influenced by the sounds of the places we've lived and the sounds of the time. And so, like, classical reform Jewish music that started in Germany when we were like, with like Solomon Zaltzer, like those kinds of melodies, those are very different. But they were also reflecting the time. We think of Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after the meal. We think of it as just such important Jewish music. They were really essentially German beer drinking songs that we adapted to Birkat Hamazon. So like we have been borrowing, even Hatikva, that was the Moldau, which is a melody that came from Europe, a folk tune. And so it is not, we shouldn't be embarrassed by the fact that we've constantly adapted melodies and genres of music wherever we've lived. We've made them Jewish and then they become Jewish music. But this is a practice that we have been doing for, I would say, thousands of years.
Wow. Okay. I think we're almost out of time, or we're really sort of a little bit over time. But I have to ask you one last question about something you say in the book, almost in passing. And it's sort of partly also a question about being a woman and, in the sort of your relationship to feminism and sort of this when you're self-confident and when you're anxious and how you manage that. But the actual question that came, the way it came to me is, did you really have to do two 7-hour interviews at Central Synagogue before committees? That's not a typo?
It is not a typo. I wish I could say.
Holy
And
cow.
I would say they really made me work for the job. And now I think that sometimes people are like, I can't believe that you were there for 8 years. Why didn't they knew who you were. In some ways it was for them, and in some ways it was for me. I had to, they asked me to talk about in depth, my educational vision, my spirituality, my view of worship, my view of like Israel, like huge topics. I took copious like notes. I went away. I read leadership books. Like I did a lot of preparation for it. And in some ways, it forced me to articulate something that I hadn't really had to do before. And so, but yes, I had to work for that. I had to work for to earn the position. And they were very long, long interviews.
That's just a lot of interviewing. But it sort of fits with other things you say about finding ways to sort of e- embrace your confidence. I mean, is there a
Yeah, and
message
I
there?
wouldn't say it was all confidence in that moment, but I think I feel like in some ways to get where I am, I had to work extra hard because I feel like I had to overcome something. And I think that in this case, it wasn't about being Asian. I think it was much more about me being a woman. And I do think that there was a way that I had to overcome people's conceptions about a woman and a mother in this role. And so there was a certain way that I think I was put maybe through more of the ringer than it would have been if it had been a standard search. I don't know, but.
You say a couple of times in the book that you were born at exactly the moment when this was possible. And is that true of the feminist movement as well?
Oh, 100%. As I say, I was born the year that the first female rabbi was ordained. And while there had been no day of my life that I had to imagine a woman couldn't be, it took decades before we saw those women enter into positions of more influence and power in the Jewish community. And you could argue it's still not equal to this day. So, in terms of who's leading federations, you have a lot of women leading, in particular larger congregations. You have a lot of women in number two positions now. That's very comfortable. But I still think that this is reflective of our society, that we're still less comfortable with women in the number one positions. And we see that reflected in our Jewish community as well, in the Jewish communal landscape.
But here you are.
Yeah. And I am standing on the shoulders of so many women who paved this path for me. I couldn't have been here without them. And I feel deeply responsible that I'm um, pulling up other women after me. And, as part of this book tour, I went to Denver and helped install Cantor Liz Sachs as now co-senior rabbi of Denver's Emmanuel congregation with another woman. And it's a beautiful model they're creating there. And I was feeling such pride that she has taken on this leadership of one of the most important synagogues in the country now. So yes, it is. Every time I get to do an installation, to me, it feels like the greatest honor because it feels like, okay, these are some of the people that are coming after me that are going to lead and surpass me. And that is my goal.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. I could ask you many more questions, but I've taken an hour. And Rabbi Buchdahl, thank you so much for speaking with us and for sharing your story. And this book is amazing.
Oh, thank you
Everyone
so,
should
so
buy
much.
it
I
and
really
read it.
appreciate it. Thank you. Or listen to it. I think it's a great way to take it into is the audio. I
Great. All
so
right.
appreciate this conversation and the community. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks.